Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this. I promise you it will be a very interesting event on citizenship and discontent in the Middle East. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lina Khatib. I'm the head of the Middle East and North Africa program here at Chatham House. And this is one of those panels in which I happen to actually know all the panelists, which is great, because then I can ask them annoying questions and, they kind of can't do much about it. This event is being live streamed, and of course it's on the record, so feel free to tweet. The hashtag is #CHEvents. And this event is being held in partnership with the Century Foundation. And we're here to celebrate the launch of a book out of a project led by the person immediately to my left. And as I said, a dear friend, Tanasi Kambanis, who's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, and who can, I guess, tell us more about the project. Obviously, today's event is very timely because we talk a lot about conflict in the Middle East at the high level, but very often what's missing in the debate is the citizen and how things look like from the perspective of people from the bottom up. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. And joining me on this really amazing panel is also Karl Scheru in the middle, who is an architect, but for a lot of people mainly known as the satirist, the man behind Karl Remarks. If anyone is on Twitter and hasn't yet followed Karl Remarks on Twitter, where have you been living? Just do it right now. If I don't read his tweets on a daily basis, I feel like get withdrawal symptoms. I don't drink coffee, but I do read your satirical tweets every day. But he's an architect by profession, and I imagine today we're going to get, I don't know which side is dominating, but I assume the more serious side of the conversation. And last but not least, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Maria Fantapi, who's a senior advisor with the International Crisis Group and who works on Kurdish issues, youth issues, amongst many other things. If you have a phone and you want to tweet, make sure it is on silent, please, especially that the event is being live streamed, and so put your phones on silent mode. And without further ado, I'm going to now let Tanasi introduce the project.
Thank you so much, Lina, for hosting us here at Chatham House. It's a real honor, and it's great to be on your stage. The Century Foundation is a 100-year-old think tank based in New York, and this project is something we've been working on for the last 2 years, which grew out of a concern that a lot of us had with the sort of epic failures of governance and of human dignity in the Middle East and North Africa. And our starting point was twofold. One, we were really tired of perspectives that tried to essentialize the region, either essentialize Arabs or essentializing Islam as somehow being the driving force in what the political outcomes in the Middle East were. And the other thing we were really tired of was people looking at questions of rights and pluralism, inclusion, minorities, majorities, and citizenship, as if there was some kind of particular pathology to the Arab world or the Middle East that distinguished it from the rest of the world. We wanted to, as a starting point, ask questions about rights and inclusion and pluralism in an international context, and with a sort of starting assumption that what happens in the Middle East is part of what's happening in the world. And we convened about 20 multidisciplinary experts, and over the course of 2 years produced a raft of research which you can read for free on our website, the Century Foundation, tcf.org, or you can order the book if you're so inclined. And judging by this demographic, I think you all, like me, would prefer the paper book. What we ended up with, we began with a lot of arguments about secularism and rights and how to how to protect different communities, religious minorities, LGBTQ people, feminist concerns, all kinds of identity-based communities in the region, how to protect or extend their rights without erasing their particular identities. And one of the first things we really came up against is there's a really pernicious and toxic and widespread tendency to try to protect communities on a communal basis. So to say, the Yazidis in Iraq must be protected as Yazidis. The Christians in Egypt are treated as second-class citizens. There needs to be some provision for Christians. And what that leads to is a sort of poisonous minority-majority racket where rights are defined communally, often based on identity or religious identity, and there's no way out of that downward spiral that leads to extending widespread rights, universal rights. And the other thing that came out of this work is a focus on the question of citizenship. In my view, certainly, I don't know if I speak for all the people who worked on this research, the quality of citizenship and the quality of rights has been eroding worldwide. There's a crisis, a global crisis, and when we started this project, we could say that the Arab world was on the leading edge of this crisis. Today, in the era of Trump and Brexit and nativism on the rise in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, authoritarianism, it's no longer clear that MENA is the leading edge. I think we have a much clearer sense of sharing a joint concern with eroded citizenship and eroded rights, and the problem of how do we promote and argue for extending universal rights in an era in which expediency and power politics have made it very popular, even among traditionally liberal and human rights-oriented governments, to erode the quality of citizenship. I'll talk about one last thing before passing on to Carl and moving into what I'm sure will be a probing and sharp Q&A from Lena. I spent a couple of years traveling back and forth to Iraq during the course of this project to ask the question of what does it look like to try and put together an inclusive identity in a society that's been riven by violence and identity-based murderous violence for at least the span of one whole generation. So we have this very detailed sense of what it looks like for societies to come apart, what it looks like for sectarian and other very visceral identities to trump the more complicated political identities that societies depend on. And I wanted to know whether we could identify a real-time example of the reverse process. And I spent quite a bit of time looking at different parts of the country, and I ended up focusing on the city of Samarra, where there was a real unique confluence of events, where we had a Shia militia led by Muqtada Sadr, who had himself recently made a turn towards, at least rhetorically, embracing the idea of secularism and Iraqi nationalist patriotism. And his militia was ruling an almost entirely Sunni city with this mandate to be non-sectarian and not predatory. So this is by no means a universal nationwide experiment, and nor is it one that's being it applies to 500,000 people in a country whose population is approaching 40 million people. So I don't want to overstate its importance, but over the course of 2 years, I was able to observe what happens when you have this confluence of a top-down order to rebuild and reorient identity, and at the same time, a bottom-up, fear-driven desire to move past a period of killing and identity-based killing. So what I was able to document in Samarra was this creation of a kind of, let's say, a unified patronage, let's say a kumbaya patronage politics, where people were invited to come in and steal a piece of the pie in harmony and set aside their sectarian identity, not kill each other, steal together, and also crucially to have security without sectarian violence being the whip that keeps people in line. And this has actually come to pass. So in a very qualified sense, it's a success story. And I put it forward at this point as a hypothesis or a question rather than as a model, right? This isn't the way forward for every sectarian, every case of sectarian violence in the region, but it is a very ripe possibility of one way that you can move past decades of identity-based violence and move into some kind of unified identity that also changes the way society is controlled. And I'll leave it at that, and happy to take whatever questions this invites.
Great. Carl, over to you.
Thank you for your generous introduction. Tanasi had already asked me to cut the paper from 20,000 words to 10,000 words. And today he wants me to cut it down to 7 minutes. What's next? Do you want me to turn it into a tweet? But seriously, the thinking in my mind when I started writing this, and if there's anyone here familiar with my work, my main kind of preoccupation as one of the leading WINA scholars in the world, Western Europe and North America, is how can I blame the West for what's happening in the Middle East? Which kind of, it started as a joke, but ultimately where it led is in thinking in the question of citizenship and the impasse that citizenship faces in the Middle East today. And this is something I've experienced myself, being born and living in the region, any kind of all these frustrated attempts at a political revival of political alternatives to sectarianism and fragmentation. The question is, where does this impasse come from? And I started to think about it more and reflecting again on my experience in the West and trying to understand what are the philosophical dimensions, the intellectual dimensions, the cultural dimensions behind this impasse. And genuinely, I felt, and I came, to Britain around 2002, I felt there's a kind of a convergence, and I don't want to overplay it. It's Lebanon and Britain are two different contexts. But there are similarities in how the rise of culturist categories of analysis, identity-based movements, the notion that difference, the recognition of difference, rather than an old school recognition of universalism, are all phenomena that are happening in parallel in both contexts. Now, they manifest themselves in different ways, but I think what they end up doing is forming a kind of an impasse in the political imagination, and particularly in the secular political imagination. Now, this is not a completely dead road. We still see very inspiring movements from Jordan to Lebanon to Egypt to Iraq, in which the slogans of secularism as a kind of a spearhead in challenging sectarian arrangements try to manifest themselves through protests, through civil initiatives, through other forms of doing politics. But inevitably, I think the failure comes from this failure of the political imagination. And I think this has very serious historic roots that emanate from things like the cultural turn, the shift within academia away, a kind of a rejection of the idea that there's any notion of a universality, all-encompassing universality that means things like people have equal rights in a universal field. That means that we can look at politics as a way of organizing interests, social struggle, aspirations, ideologies, rather than looking at the cultural dimension. So this kind of academic shift, I think, and this is probably the claim that I'm getting the most flack from, I think this shift has now acquired almost a popular dimension, right? So it's almost like a zeitgeist. Whenever you want to think about politics in universalist terms, inevitably, the structure of the world that we live in is encouraging fragmentary, divisive, culturalist readings. Now, some of the kind of proponents of this model argue that there are intersections between the struggle of different people, and that in itself is an alternative to the old way of doing things, you know, the liberal or the Marxist or the nationalist, whatever models we had in the past, that kind of claimed to be universal, that the alternative is at the intersection of the interest between those multiplicity of groups. And what I find really interesting is this again happens in the Middle East and happens in the West as well. So my claim, and I'm happy for you to interrogate it, is we are moving towards more of a kind of a universal rejection of the very concept of universalism, the legacy of the Enlightenment, the notion that we can define very broad ways of organizing society that are inclusive by virtue of universality rather than accommodating differences through paying lip service or kind of cultural promotions of this fragmentation. Maybe in the discussion I'll give more examples, but that then what that takes me to is whatever attempts we are seeing towards a restoration, in my mind, of what is a healthier model of doing politics, a way of reviving a stalled transition to modernity in its political and social forms in the West, is going to come up against these intellectual barriers that by now we're in the third or fourth decade probably of this transition that again starts from the universities, but my claim is taking a much stronger hold within society, both with the Middle East and in the West, is forming a kind of a block for what I call the political imagination. So the purpose of the report, which at length I looked at different examples and ultimately kind of trying to emphasize this argument, is if we want to move beyond this, and to echo some of the things that Tanasi, and obviously we've had a long debates about that, we have to go beyond this framework of recognition of minorities. We have to understand that different groups have different challenges. This is certainly not a call to ignore the different problems, the different rooms have different contexts, but the claim is that we can restore that through a much broader philosophical and political framework, because inevitably, and that's the last point that I'm going to end up in, and again, it's something that I observe in a place like Lebanon, where the claim is that sectarianism is a primordial thing over there and will always be like that. In fact, it's an, and I mentioned this, it's an antecedent of phenomena that are now manifesting themselves in the West. It's a way of organizing society and politics around those groups. And in organizing it in these confessional arrangements, it's a self-reproducing form, right? It's a form that kind of gives itself legitimacy and longevity through this process of recognizing group, organizing their interaction, and preventing the kind of the natural evolution of broader currents within society. But the argument is that all is not lost. And the more we tend to try to resolve those issues by nurturing these differences, is we're actually being self-defeating. So ultimately, what I was trying to write is a call of arms. How do we reconceive of universality today while taking all these legitimate critiques that come from a more cultural perspective over the past few decades? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Maria.
Yes, thank you. I want to actually link my points also to what you just said about how we can actually join forces in moving for sort of change. Because the research that I have led with my co-author Khaled Saleh started exactly in this way, in a sort of synergy that we found as a young female professional, working in big institutions, and actually doing fieldwork in Iraqi Kurdistan, the northern region of Iraq, with young Kurds. What these two profiles of people have in common, one will say, according to common rationality, nothing. If we apply these divisive and fragmented categories that put us one against the other. But in reality, we found that we had a lot in common. because we as young professional women, we also felt that we were part of a generation which was raised and educated to a value of diversity. We thought that we have the possibility actually to see in our professional future equal rights for male and female, diversity in the institution where we are going to work on, while we were facing in our professional lives a lot of obstacles. We were seeing that the society was actually, even with the Me Too movement, moving very fast. But institutions, even international institutions, the UN, others, I mean, were moving very slowly to actually be receptive of that change. So we found that young Kurds had sort of the same problem, because they had nurtured an idea of citizenship and national identity, which was actually going very much beyond the simple concept of I want a nation that is for my own Kurdish people. They wanted something more. They wanted also a new type of relationship with their leadership. They want their leadership to recognize them as citizens and not just as Kurds. But at the same time, they found a sort of institutional blockage in front of them. They had no avenues of political participations or participation to the political scene that could channel these ideas. The political scene was dominated by a generation that was claiming also rightfully to be the one who led the national struggle, the Kurdish national struggle against the old regime of Saddam Hussein. So they had the legitimacy to be there, and they had also brought this institution of Iraqi Kurdistan into place from 1990s up until today. But somehow, by all this had also led them to promote a sort of form of nationalism that was just an ethno-nationalism that didn't integrate this component of citizenship. So no matter, however, how much there was this new generation in Iraqi Kurdistan, there is this new generation in Iraqi Kurdistan who calls for this and who actually has a genuine intention of seeing this aspiration reflected at the top leadership level, there is sort of a disconnection between what this generation wants and what the institution in Kurdistan actually can receive and absorb. So it's a sort of a situation where the society and the leadership are sort of unsynced, and there is no channel of communication between the two. And this is a situation which, of course, in certain cases leads to conflict. In other cases, leads to, conflict, uprising, popular, mobilization of the street against the leadership. In other cases, it leads to a fragmentation of the society, because when you have a leadership, as in the case of Kurdistan, that can that has the resources to actually redistribute to the society, then you have also part of the society who has, and even part of those young Kurds who actually wants to see a new leadership into place, that they compromise and they adapt with the system and they become dependent on them. So they're sort of muted in their aspiration to see change. And of course, the rentierist system, a clientelist system, who has a very divisive effect on the society. So all this reflection on how actually societies are bringing a new form of political culture, new national identities, new way of defining what it means to be part of that nation, what it means to be part, and the gap between that and what the leadership can absorb, it has been really an essential part of our reflection in this paper on Kurdish nationalism. That, again, it has been a very interesting case study, because in a situation, in a case study like Kurdistan, where you have a nation but you don't have a state, the relationship between leadership and society and that type of social contract is defining also what type of nation and project you have for your future.
Thank you so much. And on that note, I want to circle back to you, Tanasi, as the leader of this project. And you said something, of course, you're going to have to say something provocative. You said something that kind of, alerted me, which is how people got together to steal together as one way of overcoming the identity division. So here I'm thinking, of course, you were talking about Iraq. I'm thinking about, naturally, Lebanon as a comparative case, considering that I'm British Lebanese, and I very much grew up in this system of stealing together that has continued to manifest itself over the years with catastrophic results. So my question is, aren't we really talking here about short-term kind of success that might eventually lead to what Maria was talking about, which relates also to the work that my colleague standing at the back, Renad Mansour, works on in his work in the Iraq Initiative here at Chatham House, which is the gap between the elites and the citizen. Are we not creating a new problem for the future?
So we're talking about two different, sometimes conflicting levels, right? One is governance and the other is identity or narrative. And I think the level on which I'm trying to find some possibility in the political imagination is on the level of narrative, where we have, in the main, all across the region, we have stories that are completely exclusionary. Right, so you have Arab nationalism, a story about Arab nationalism that has no room for non-Arabs in it, and you have Arabs who will say, well, Arab nationalism is completely welcoming to a Kurd, and a Kurd would say, well, I don't hear myself in this story. So what was interesting about these experiments is the extent to which, not to which they're stealing together, which is, as you correctly point out, it's an expedient, short-term, it's a coexistence framework which can shift the second the incentives change. And Lebanon is an example where they don't even steal together. They steal in parallel. And it's a different story, right? The Lebanese story is one in which each community runs itself. It's the millet system in the modern age. What we're looking for is something different, something where we hear some other story, whether it's Iraqi nationalism, whether it's socialism, communism, social democracy. We saw this briefly during the uprisings where there was bread freedom and social justice as a slogan that was vague enough but mobilizing enough that people from different identity groups and backgrounds could see themselves as part of it. The other thing that keeps coming up as a third rail is all the different taboo identities. So you're allowed to be a liberal, let's say, but you're not allowed to be gay. You're allowed to be a Christian, but you're not allowed to be, a Yazidi. And there's a whole host of these kinds of rights claims that are policed out even by people who are supposedly on the side of universal rights. And this comes up a lot when you have the practical question of governing, how to run things, because this is where it matters, is where you say, okay, do I have standing to be part of a government or get a patronage job or make decisions or cast a vote or be a candidate in your movement? And that is where we see these groups policed out of existence. And I do think that stealing together can be a prelude to having a shared identity, but only if it is in the context of self-consciously and affirmatively crafting a new shared identity. And it's very rare that anyone does that in the region.
Okay, I'm sure people will have some questions about that. Maria, I'm just interested. You talked about the perspective of you and others, as you put it, young female researchers feeling perhaps a connection with the people you were studying. But I'm just interested, did they feel the same affinity towards you?
No, actually, quoting one of the interview we had in the Bazaar of Suleimania, which is this town at the border between Iraq and Iran, one of this young boy who was working there as a seller, he told us, yeah, I mean, we are not like the like you who are like you are, you know, privileged, and you could, of course, go to, I mean, you are educated. We are here, and we are going to just. So of course there is not that sense of, I mean, from the other side, I think there is, on the contrary, they see any foreign researcher as a sort of a privileged, a privileged actor that is observing them. But I think that where there was an empathy, it was a moment where they felt that we were listening to them, because I think that especially in a situation where you don't have avenue for political participation, where you don't have anymore so many good free media, like in the case of Kurdistan now, I think to be heard and also discuss this issue, it's something that already opens up for an empathy. We actually, once we published this paper, we got a lot of very good feedback, because I think that what is frustrating for many of these young people, it's to feel almost invisible and destined to be just dependent on others, and not be able to affirm their, I mean, to actually shape their future in the way they want. This is why also one other takeaway of this paper is that what we understood is that many of the young Kurds who migrated during the refugee crisis from Iraqi Kurdistan to Europe, they didn't do it for economic reason. But it was really a way in which they could like see themselves, you know, getting out from this system of clientelist dependence that was starting from the top at the level of the leadership, but was trickling down from the family structures themselves, and like shaping their own future somewhere else.
And you mentioned something very important now in your answer, which is the importance of feeling they're being listened to. This is missed, including, Carl, in what you said about, for example, people in the West, if we can talk broadly, when they use stale categories like sectarianism as just a feature of the Middle East that has always been there and will always be there. This is an example of not listening. Because if they were to listen, they would see that the situation is not so simple. But I think sometimes simple categories, especially in policy debate, kind of tend to dominate. But on that note, you also mentioned kind of what is happening in the West, again, broadly speaking, today. I'm wondering, are you detecting any sense of kind of self-reflection going on in the West, recognition that, oh God, maybe these things that we thought only happen out there are also happening here, or not?
I think, to be honest, 2016 was the turning point, right? And I think a lot of people had to kind of pull a very, you know, hard handbrake after 2016, because I'm still, you know, not convinced with a lot of the simplistic narratives for, you know, things like Brexit or the election of Trump. But I think there's a recognition that identity and identity-based politics is kind of spreading in movement, right? And it's spreading, whereas it had started from the left, it's spreading to the right. And in a way, it's almost like a parody. It was the right kind of appropriating the tools of identity, which, you know, for a lot on the left, there was a kind of a moment of awkwardness that we've promoted these ideas for a long time, and now they've been appropriated, caricaturized, all those sorts of things. But I think then again, looking at what's really interesting, because I'm not really interested in the West, I'm interested in the Middle East, I'm using it as a comparative, is to then try to reflect, you know, we often ourselves fall into this trap, and a lot of the scholars of trying to understand sectarianism as almost like a primordial thing over there. But also to be aware, and this is, I find very interesting in the last 20 years, when I started kind of meeting more and more people that come study in the West, and to my mind get brainwashed in the culturalist logic, intentionally being provocative, then they go back to Lebanon, right? They left arguing against sectarianism, and they come back, right, and in this kind of like, recognition of difference, promoting politics that recognize difference. And I'm like, well, the natural conclusion of that, then you should celebrate sectarianism. And each one of you should go back to their sect, and we should say, we Maronites, we deserve to be special, we Shias, we deserve, which is, by the way, what they're doing. And this is the kind of what I'm trying to say over here is what happened since the end of the war. It's no longer about a life and death scenario and daily fighting and all that kind of thing. You start to get all these weird insecurities about, our culture is being changed, and we're not like the Shias, we're not like the Sunnis. And you start to get all these things. And then there's echoes of, again, how group demands are formulated in the West. So there's definitely, I think, to my mind, a more kind of, ironically, universal malaise that drives this. But ultimately, there must be political answers to it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I asked the question hoping maybe some glimmer of light, but I got the opposite, but it's very important. So on that note, now is the time for audience questions. Please introduce yourself. If you're a Chatham House member, tell us your other stuff that you do in life other than being a Chatham House member. Let's see, we have the gentleman there. Yes, but wait for the microphone, please, because this is being live streamed. It's just behind you.
Lord Hilton, Independent House of Lords. I think one of your speakers touched on a very important concept.
Can you introduce yourself, please? Oh. Sorry, is the microphone on? It is on. Oh, okay, sorry.
Hello?
Yeah.
Is that better? A very important concept, namely political imagination. If you look where there have been wars since, shall we say, 1945, it's usually over the breakup of empires, where people, for a variety of reasons, are unable to imagine themselves as citizens of a new entity who want to live together harmoniously. I leave you with that thought.
Thank you. It's a very good thought. And we are going to move to this side of the room, please, with the microphone. Yeah, there. Just again behind you. There's two people carrying microphones. So.
Hi, my name is Katerina Dallacura from London School of Economics. If we imagine that in the future there is an overcoming of sectarian, collectivist, ethnic, particularist identities, could this be in the shape of national identity? Of course, there's a lot of association between nationalism and exclusionary identity and bad things we associate with nationalism. But could we see in the Middle East, in reaction to what is going on at the moment, an enlightened version of nationalism that could be the answer to many of the problems of the region? I'm not talking about citizenship, rights and duties, but more capturing the imagination again. So Iraqi nationalism, even Lebanese nationalism, even in that context, Turkish, Kurdish nationalism. That's the question.
Okay, thank you so much. I could take one more before turning to the panel. Yes, please, in the middle.
Thank you very much. Babak Imamian, British Iranian Business Association. In 1979, the Iranians went to a referendum voting for Islamic Republic, not knowing what it is. In 2016, the British people went for Brexit, not knowing what it is. Now, the political system of... Yeah, absolutely. The political system in UK is far ahead of Iran. So what was the cause of it? Mass politics. Now, if you look from founders of US Constitution, from Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson to Taft, William Taft, 909 president, all of them talk about danger of mass politics. And we had safeguards for that. And in 1930s, we didn't have the safeguards. But after the World War II, we put the safeguards. Then again, the safeguards went off after 1992 collapse of Soviet Unions. And that's the biggest danger we have now, that our democracy has no safeguards.
Thank you so much. Well, we have three very, very sharp to the point points that each deserve a new book, Tanasi. So, I'm going to leave it open to you guys. Who would like to start? Yeah?
Okay, I'll start with Katerina's question, which I like a lot. You know, nationalism is a terrible antidote to fragmentation, because if you look at the last century, whether you look at National Socialism in the 30s in Europe, whether you look at white nationalism today, it is a dangerous, often murderous ideology. In the Middle East, its most relevant incarnations are Baathism and Arab nationalism. Again, not happy examples of collective identity building and community building. Another assumption that's related to this, I brought to this research the assumption that both that nationalism could be a potential haven, and also that the state is good, right? Strengthening the state is the antidote to all this terrible entropy and misgovernance. Lebanon, cannibalized state, the answer is a better state. You know, Iraq, the state destroyed by first Saddam and then by the US invasion. But then when I talk to people, a lot of Iraqis, for example, and a lot of Lebanese will say, as much as we detest the misrule that we're under today, the last thing we want is a hyper-empowered state that can then become predatory and do to us what Saddam did. Or, you know, imagine Lebanon with everything that's wrong with it, plus a powerful state that could oppress us. That would be far worse. And so, you know, to me, of course, this leaves, you know, no obvious good choice. But the you know, the hypothesis is that ideas evolve, and that you can evoke today a national consciousness in Iraq, for example, that would be something that speaks to Kurds and Arabs, Christians, Muslims, other religions, and the non-religious. Now, mind you, almost no one speaks this way, and this is one of the interesting absences in the region. When you look for people who are openly secular or genuinely inclusive, or who will support rights that they themselves don't benefit from, very few and far between, but there are avatars of this kind of universal identity building, and sometimes real people. I mean, we had Abdel Munem Abul Futu ran for president in Egypt, former deputy supreme guide of the Muslim Brotherhood. He partnered up with a secular communist woman and designed this movement, which a lot of people didn't believe that he meant it, but he did. He meant it. He evolved. He changed, and he had an idea of Egyptian patriotism and identity that was open to secular people, LGBTQ people, ex-brothers, Salafis, religious people, non-religious people. So there are examples like this. They're always, they always have, I think, problematic sides to them, and usually it's a form of chauvinism, or in the case of like Muqtada Sadr in Iraq, a form of internal authoritarianism. So where in Iraq, there's this movement being created where there is room for all these identities, but on Muqtada's terms by his prerogative. So he decides, you know, I woke up today and I changed my mind, and this is our new inclusive identity. You're welcome to it. And no further discussion. So I think that's what's on the table. And when and if someone in power evokes these things, that's when we'll see what develops. And I bet you we'll have cases in the next 10 or 20 years where inclusive nationalist ideologies are used to rile up massacres and abuses of power. And that will further sully these ideas of inclusion and community building.
I think Carl wants to disagree.
I really want to disagree with Tanasi here. So I think it's yeah, exactly, waiting for my opportunity. I think it's a great question, you know, and as I don't know if I'm allowed to say this in Chatham House, as an old Marxist, I should be against nationalism, but I think...
Former or aging?
Aging, clearly. I think nationalism, let's put it in the spirit. I mean, Tanasi was very sneaky because the two examples he gave you of what nationalism is white nationalism and Nazis, right? There's lots of nationalism that are not about that. There's Germany in 1848, right? There's the old Republican ideal. There's the ideal that comes out of the Enlightenment. And it's framed in terms of the people wresting control of their destiny from monarchs and from the church and from inherited authority. That ideal, we shouldn't kick it. And in fact, I think the problem with versions of it like Baathism is they were never complete nationalisms in the sense that Syria or Iraq is a definite entity, is a final entity, right? They were always stepping stones to some, sorry for saying this, shitty fantasy of a pan-Arab unity that's kind of subjugate the entire world. They were essentially, you know, quasi-fascist dystopias that manifest themselves, you know, in different ways and kind of allow those types of characters to come to power. But the aspiration towards a form of nationalism that is positive, that's inclusive, gives a lot of alternatives for all sorts of things that we're seeing. Sectarian fragmentation, and the kind of the ISIS vision, which is kind of supranational in so many respects, is the antithesis of the idea of a multinational, multicultural state like Iraq, which had various religions, various sects, various nationalities. It hasn't had a happy history, but that happy history isn't always internally, for internal reason, you know. There's colonialism, there's Western intervention, there are all sorts of things, right? So I'm very positive about that. And I think ultimately it is a vehicle that can be inclusive, can be functioning, and more importantly, turning to you, sir, in a very short sentence, we shouldn't be afraid of mass politics. We shouldn't be afraid of democracy. The problem with the world today is we tend to fear these things, and we think that elite checks and balances are actually a control. No. The faith in democracy is actually a much better guarantor of the success of a society, to my mind. And I'll leave it at that note.
Mario.
Well, I will just end probably on the note of the political imagination, because I think it's a very beautiful concept that you brought into the discussion. And I think that, I mean, there is a desperate need for political imagination. I just sometimes think that we don't have the structure for that political imagination to grow. And here we come back with this issue of the institutional impasse in where we are, and the enormous obstacles that we, with our managerial way of structuring our even day-to-day work, we put our limits I mean, we create our own obstacles that prevents us from actually see broader and actually develop that vision. So I would just think that our reflection, probably the topic of the next book, Tanasi, should be how can we overcome this obstacle. And like this political imagination, it is present. There are visionaries in these words. There is visionaries, but how can that vision actually then shape the future? And how can we overcome that obstacle that prevent this from happening today?
Great. Another round of questions, and we have three. Okay, so let's take those three, starting with our dear friend Mehrdad at the front. Please introduce yourself to the crowd.
My name is Mehrdad Konsari. I'm a Chatham House member and Iranian Center for Policy Studies. My question is, in terms of your study, in terms of what you're coming out with, something that I'm working on has to do with two specific terms: consensus building, national reconciliation, and of course, the peaceful nature of promoting change. For example, in my own country, Iran, we have great divisions, and one of the things, I think majority of people want change, but people are afraid that at what cost will that change have to come. Iran, nobody wants another Syria or Iraq in Iran as much as they want change. So emphasis is on consensus building, but consensus building and national reconciliation for the promotion of major change. In other words, not the retention of the status quo, or like in South Africa, for example, national reconciliation was conducted not to retain the apartheid system. So where does this come into your study?
Okay, thank you. And we've got someone, yes, in red there, thanks.
Thank you for your speeches. I'm Maria González Mendivil. I come from Spain. I'm on an internship at Intelligence and Public Affairs. And I would like to ask for the two last points that you made. You tell us about the faith in democracy, but do you think that democracy can be extrapolated to tribal societies such as the one in Libya, for example?
Okay, and final question of the night. There, front row.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Karwan Jamal Tahir. I'm Kurdistan Regional Government High Representative to the United Kingdom. Although I have a great hair, but I am a new generation, so I had the opportunity in Kurdistan region to be part of the political, involved politically, and I'm representative now. And like what you said, which I disagree with you, that Kurdistan region and young people are not involved in politics and daily base governance in Kurdistan. And they are not privileged of education. In Kurdistan region, there is 30 universities, 2 American universities, and British colleges are opened in Kurdistan region, and everyone have the opportunity to access higher education, and education is free in Kurdistan region. And the involvement in government, in institutions, in parliament, for the young people, the ratio is really high. If you look at our parliament, you see how many, young people are participating, and the women as well. The percentage are 30% of the women are part of their political engagement in Kurdistan region. The topic of identity is really important, and I think this is a core matter in the Middle East. And I wrote a piece last month about the identity in the Middle East, because Middle East have identity problem, and they attached the Arab identity to the Middle East. Middle East are not only Arab nation. There's other nations lives in the Middle East. Israel is part of the Middle East. Turkey is part of the Middle East. So we have the nations of Turk, Arab, Persia, and Kurd. Kurd is a nation in the Middle East. The denial and unrecognition of the identity of the Middle East, not only for the last few decades, but century ago, led to the ongoing conflict up until our today. And my final point on the citizenship. Yes, in Iraq and Kurdistan region, we have a citizenship conflict matter, but not with Kurdistan region. Over the last few decades, we have a citizenship problem with the Iraqi government, because we want to be an equal citizen in Iraq. So as a Kurd, we have both citizenship problem as well as identity problem. But if we prioritize them, the identity problem will become first. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to give you each 1 minute to just give very quick answers to the questions. Maria, we're going to move this way, starting with you. 1 minute, please, because we're almost, if you have anything.
Well, yes, I mean, I think that our paper is not just about the young generation, it's about all components of the society, even older, that have a different vision for how to move forward. They propose a new pact with the leadership, so it's not just about young people. And again, here, I think this is a global challenge, that one that we don't want, it's not about when we talk about pushing or like supporting diversity at the leadership level, I think that we should be very careful not to have a quantitative approach and saying, okay, how many young people you have or how many women you have. It is really about bringing a new culture. And that is the tallest challenge that we have.
Thank you. Carl.
I'm going to take the point about can democracy work in a tribal society? I think you put it, and it's actually quite interesting because I encourage you to read my essay because I talk about at length. And it's one of the things that I noticed actually, like everyone on the political spectrum today agrees on that doesn't work, right? So the left says the East is different to the West. And this is particularly comes across from post-colonial theory. Things like, you know, universal enlightenment ideals, representative democracy, all these things, they're not suitable. And people parrot that, you know, they're like, oh, representative democracy isn't necessarily good for these societies, and then just kind of justify in the process of doing that all sorts of authoritarian governments, right? The right then turns and says, no, but these people are so backward, democracy is not suitable for them. And I think really, the people are asking that question because they themselves don't have faith in democracy. And ultimately, for me, the proper panacea for this, the proper cure for this is to restore the sense of faith in democracy. But I end on one single point. Whenever I say that in a public forum, someone will come over to me and say, how can you say you have complete faith in democracy? You're a fascist. And I'm like, how? And this is the kind of, we have such a degraded understanding of what democracy is today, and it broadly reflects and kind of institutionalized, elitist, lack of confidence in everything that democracy represents that makes those sentiments possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Tanasi.
So I'll try on 2 quick points. One is, I think, in good faith, if you explore what actually happens in every society, including Arab societies in the Middle East, you find there is no essentialist break on what's possible. So it's, I mean, I don't think you meant it this way, but the core of the question is offensive and wrong in its essence, okay? Any type of people can be any type of government or society. A tribal area can be democratic, a enlightened, rich Western area can be fascist, and so on and so forth. Everything is possible. And in the Arab world today, you can find examples of almost every type of self-organizing and self-identity. And I think that needs to be a new starting point for all conversations about policy and politics in the Middle East, because otherwise we end up in these often racist, often essentialist, often, I think, you know, problematic frameworks for talking about what's possible. And Mehrdad, I think your question is great because in the region, we're hostage often to self-interested elites and oppressive systems that threaten après-moi le déluge. If you try to change the system, there will be chaos. You know, do you want Libya or do you want the mullahs? Do you want Syria or do you want, you know, prosperous Sisi's Egypt? And these are bullshit binaries, right? We know, in fact, that there are other alternatives. Carl mentioned democracy a lot. I find it helpful to mention universal rights a lot because maybe you know, the idea of reorganizing as a democracy feels too radical as a first step. Great. Are you going to be opposed to universal rights, however? And if you force these oppressive leaders to say, well, we're against your rights, I think that's a much harder position for them to take than it is for them to say, well, you know, we all love democracy, but it's very hard to implement right now. You say, great, how about take the first step, extend universal rights, and then we can argue about the governing process. And I think we can force or try to force leaderships and also advocacy groups, by the way, who buy into these limiting frameworks to step out of it and say that it's not about, you know, change, reform or chaos, but about more rights for more people.
Thank you. And I also want to say thank you because the three of you in your last answers each gave kind of a tip for things that we can practically do to make things better. So at least we managed to end it on a positive note, one way or another. So please join me in thanking this really wonderful panel.